Welcome to the Crazy Wisdom Podcast. My guest today is Sam Marelich. He is the founder of Next Ventures, a recruiting company that recruits for venture-backed startups. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So what is the essence of recruiting?
I think the essence of recruiting is, if you think about like executive functions, right? Like what is the most important thing that you do at a company? My very unsexy answer is getting paid is the most important thing that a company does. Everything is an abstraction away from that, right? Like if you don't get paid, then the business doesn't last very long. And then before you get paid, you have to make a sale. But in order to make a sale and in order to do anything at a company, obviously you have to have a product or a service to sell. But all of this comes back to you need to have a team, right? And recruiting is all about finding the very best people, putting them into your team. Ideally with, my view as an external recruiter is I want to find my clients the very best people as quickly as possible with regard to impact on their time, because I work with a lot of founders. They don't have a lot of time. They're trying to do too many things at once. Hiring is a huge problem. So that's kind of how I think about it. Tricky one to start with. I like it.
Yeah, I told you, I mentioned before we go right into it. Okay, so recruiting, what is the difference between internal recruiting and external recruiting? And at the last company I worked with, they they're building their own external recruiting, but it's all started from their internal recruiting. And I remember, I'm not sure if this is accurate or not, but I remember there was some they weren't okay with hiring an external recruiter. I think probably because the founder was so good at recruiting specifically. But what is the tension between external recruiting and internal recruiting, and why would a company hire an external recruiter?
Yeah, I think I primarily deal with venture-backed startups, so I'm going to limit my answer to that. I don't want to talk about like big companies have various rationale. I think there's a good rationale for if you're doing any sort of executive recruiting, it makes sense to bring on external recruiters who aren't necessarily going to be biased in the process.
Yeah.
But the way I would think about it at an early stage process is that an external recruiter really exists, or external recruiters across multiple disciplines exist to augment the founding team until you get to the point where you do build an internal recruiting team. And then often they're also there to help augment that internal recruiting team as well. So, for example, like, yes, you could hire an internal recruiter as your fifth hire. And some companies have done this. Some companies have been very successful with this. But, say your hires 10 to 20 are, you want to hire a couple of engineers, you want to hire a few marketing people, you need to hire your first 3 salespeople, and you also need to hire a few business generalists. Yes, you could hire a generalist internal recruiter, or you could work with a few different external recruiters, who are specialized in one thing I found about recruiting is there is literally a recruiter for every single niche. There are recruiters out there who find school teachers for international schools. There are recruiters out there who recruit ship captains. There are recruiters out there who recruit civil engineers. Like, if you can name a niche, there are recruiters in that space who will help you find it. It's like the most niche thing ever. There will be recruiters out there that will recruit pilots. You like just anything you can think of. There are recruiters who help companies fill that talent gap.
Do you know
I think the other thing.
Oh, yeah, go for it.
I think the other thing, and this is, I am being a little bit broad brushed here, but often one of the differences between internal recruiters and external recruiters, often internal recruiters are held to expect, they're expected to hire a lot more people than external recruiters. So one of the things that you often see, not always, but you often see internal recruiters lean on is they're more likely to lean on job ads, and they're more likely to lean on inbound leads. Now this works, obviously, if you've got an employer brand, if you're building out that employer brand. One of my positions when it comes to go-to-market and B2B SaaS hiring is, unless you are hiring for SDRs, there is zero value. in running job ads. SDRs are the only time, SDRs are very junior
Interesting.
salespeople. It's the only time where that equation is flipped and you actually should run a job ad, but the rest of your time, you're wasting your time.
Yeah, okay, that's really interesting. It's the only entry level. Okay, now we can go into what we were talking about beforehand of AI and how AI is going to change this. I guess the first question is, are you using any AI tools to improve your process already? And if so, what are they?
Yeah, I think the only real tool I'm using in terms of AI is I'm doing some outbound business development campaigns and I'm using Clay, which I love. If you're doing any sort of outbound B2B, like lead scoring and that sort of thing, I couldn't recommend a software more. I wish I was paid by them, but I'm not. One of the ways that I have used AI and it's been extremely useful is, taking a large list of companies and asking, ChatGPT, is this company B2B or B2C? Because if a company is B2B, then it's worth us reaching out to. If it's B2C, it's not worth reaching out to. I have seen some of the AI tools, LinkedIn Recruiter, for example, they've brought in like AI message generation. It sucks. Like it's awful. I have seen there's a guy on Twitter, a buddy of mine, his name's Nicholas Verge. He's a copywriter, and actually, you should talk to him.
Yeah.
And he's got like some really good stuff on how to use AI to help create marketing assets, but not so much, hey, this is like you like turn it into output, but more helping you do like a lot of the framework that goes behind creating good marketing ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So I think like the way I think about AI is it's useful in the same way that learning how to use a macro in Excel is useful. It's useful in the same way that learning Zapier or Make is really useful. Like it just helps you automate stuff significantly faster, significantly better. But like anything, like the quality of the input really defines the quality of the output. And that's where you see a lot of AI crap. I think the funniest thing is you see it on Twitter, right? Or like LinkedIn, where you get these obviously AI responses that are just like summarizing and agreeing with what you said. And I always just like sit back and I think to myself, like, what thought process is going on in the back of the mind of someone who uses this?
Yeah.
Like, how this doesn't work. Like we know that it doesn't work.
Well, it's really funny because, and this leads into the question about how it's going to change recruiting as well. And I definitely agree that what you just said is absolutely accurate. It's like when you have those threads, and usually it's like historical video thread or whatever that posts this original video and has an AI generated content. And then now Twitter is basically, as long as it's something like that, every single response is an AI generated thing. And it's just like, I want to find out some interesting fact. And sometimes they actually do it well, where an AI generated thing will actually give me the interesting fact related to this original post. But more normally it's just like bullshit, or other crazy, other story, other interesting thing. And yeah, so it's just like it's creating, it's like we're going to have various arms races. One arms race I'm really looking forward to is the entrepreneur versus the bureaucrats, and the bureaucracies the entrepreneurs will implement AI in order to get around the bureaucracies. The bureaucracies will then also invent AIs in order to stop that. Another arms race which will be funny, I think, is in the realm of recruiting, which we talked about it all this weekend, was that there are job applicants are now using AI in order to get their applications into the hands of many people. Companies are also using AI in order to filter through all of those job requirements. So it's going to be like so much stuff behind the scenes that's happening. And then the result will, maybe people get better jobs. But if we look at the last 50 years, it probably just means more and more wasted time, because the amount of people who win is just like such a small amount of people. And then that brings in the recruiting, which is that I think from what you were saying earlier, is the external recruiters have a network, whereas the internal recruiters have already used their network and now just need to create job postings. Anything that was highlighted in that ramble that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I think let me take you back 10 years, right? And I want to just walk you through like a situation, because I think this demonstrates how I think about a lot of this. I'm from New Zealand, and in my hometown, there was like this technology company, and they were able to like robocall basically the entire city, right? 180,000 people. And it was like, I think it was either like a mayoral or like a a governmental election. And I just couldn't help but think, like, if you got a robocall, like, would it actually influence the way you voted?
Oh,
Like, I just know it wouldn't
yeah.
influence the way I voted, right? And
Yeah.
I think, like, look, if you're a job seeker, I don't think you are getting anything from AI in terms of using it to write your applications. I think if you are a company, I mean, I think the biggest like danger of AI within this like context is it just destroys channels, right? Frankly, like one of the difficulties in sales over the last few years is the channel for email has more or less been destroyed
Wow.
because people are getting too many emails. We're seeing that also in terms of like, the fact that you now have to spin up a bunch of sending domains. You need to do all of these things just in order to get your cold emails sent. There's kind of been like very lax enforcement in terms of phone calls. And so now like the phone, I think as a channel is significantly degraded to where it was 5 or 6 years ago. You can't just cold call in the same way you could back in 2018. And so I think like that's the danger with things like AI is look, I'll give you an example, right? As I said, I only really believe in recruiting through job ads if you're hiring for an SDR. And last August, I did a job search or like I ran a job ad. I was hiring for 2 SDRs for a client. I put a job ad up on LinkedIn. It was up for 4 days and I got 800 applicants. Now, I already had some filters set up so that people were auto-rejected. People were auto-rejected if they did not live in the US. People were auto-rejected if they needed a visa to live in the US, which is unfortunate, but just part of the game. But I still had about 800 applicants to go through. Now, if you are a recruiter, if you are sitting on that side, you have to think this through. If you spend 30 seconds looking at a profile, which I think is probably generous, but if we include like just refreshing pages and that sort of thing, let's say 30 seconds, that's 400 minutes, right? That's 6.5 hours that you have spent looking through profiles. And then the other thing, I think again, like candidates probably don't want to hear this, but like, you're not like this idea of like, hey, you have to give everyone a fair chance. Like it doesn't actually exist, right? Like you can't just look at 100 applicants and be like, that's enough, right? Like that's just part of the way that the world works. Like, let's be real. I looked through about half of them. I spent like a good 4 or 5 hours looking through all of these applicants. I probably messaged maybe 40 or so of them. I think I probably talked to 25 of them, and I ended up hiring 2 people out of it. It was a good use of my time. But if you think about that, like across a bunch of different domains, like if you're getting 2,000 applicants for a job posting, like your odds of getting into Harvard are significantly better, frankly, than than that from the job ad. I don't know if you're familiar with the CEO of Mercury. His name's Ahmad. I'm not sure his last name. Great. I use them as my business bank. They're really good. But he had a tweet a couple of years ago, and that he was talking about the different ways that that candidates get recruited. And if you were referred, and I'm not sure exactly at what point they started counting this, right? So that's like where I'm a little bit careful with the stats. But if you were referred, basically like you had a 10% chance of getting a job, right? So super high chance, really. If you were externally sourced, so like the recruiters went out and wanted to talk to you, you had about a 4% chance, 5% chance. So like 1 in 20, 1 in 25 chance. And I would say like that stacks with just what I've seen, right? Like if I talk to 20 people, I'm probably going to hire 1, maybe 2 of them. And then if you were applying, you had a 1 in 330 chance of getting hired. That was from, I think, 2021 or 2022. In 2024, that number is now over 1 in 1,000, but the other numbers still
Wow.
stand kind of true. And that's partly just because we're seeing a bit of an economic downturn. But yeah, just shows
But
like,
it also
you
feels
know,
like the state of things to come. Like the online world is going to become, like it has been for the past 10 years. It's just going to become 1%, 0.1% gets all the benefits, and then everyone else is totally invisible.
yep.
And then now there's a new theme, which is the one we discussed before, which is AI is creating crazy amounts of content that nobody's reading, nobody wants to read, except for some random small percentage of the population who just really loves it. And so and this is the kind of, could go into a more philosophical bent if you're up for it, which is just basically like that like what we're doing right now. This is a video call. This probably isn't going to change too much, but anything involving the public on the internet is going to change really drastically. And so people might start to move more towards in-person stuff. I guess it ropes back to recruiting as well, because it's also like one of the main things that I saw the founder of the company that I was previously working with was that most of the ways that he found good quality people was through events, dinners, like meeting people in person, asking current employees to bring their friends. Like that's the way, like, and now that's the way that I've realized that it's like, oh, okay, I just got to meet as many people as possible in person. But then the geographical limitations show up, about like actually needed to be in certain places. We could talk about this as well as like, imagine that you're in the US, and
I'm in New York. Yeah.
in New
So
York. Yeah,
I've got
exactly. Yeah,
opinions.
yeah, yeah. Bring them.
I think, yeah, I think maybe one way to think about this conceptually, and this is kind of where my thinking has shifted, is you don't want to be in a channel where everyone else is, right? So if because like if you're in a channel with everyone else, it's like the opposite of 0 to 1, right? Like if you have a monopoly, like a monopoly is great, right? When everyone has a podcast, it's really hard to stand out with a podcast. When everyone, but then also I do think like the like flip side of this is there is actually also a lot less competition than you think, right? Like it's something like 99% of podcasts don't get to 20 episodes.
Yeah.
So like I feel like you need to kind of like put that with a grain of salt. I don't have a particularly big Twitter following, but I was in this group about 2 years ago, right? And it was like people, and we were like, hey, we're going to learn how to use Twitter. We're going to start using it. We're going to post every day. We're just going to build like our personal brands. I had like 300 people who were following me before that, but it was all just like friends from university and miscellaneous people. Because I'm a Twitter addict, always have been, like for I think since 2012 or so now. So like for a long time. But one thing I noticed is, if you post a tweet a day and there are 30 of you in a group, like there are going to be 3 by the end of the year. It's everything's a war of attrition, and people, they change priorities, they burn out, like, they decide that it wasn't there, whatever it may be. But like, I think you have to kind of think about that. But yeah, I think when it comes to things like being online versus being in person, I'll give you an example, right? Like this is just a funny one, like from last week. I've started calling people, right? If I'm like reaching out to a business, for like business development, and I get like an email back and there's a phone number in the signature, like just giving them a call. I called like 5 or 6 people on Friday, booked like 2 meetings from it, had like 4 people reply. I was like, this is the easiest 15 minutes I've spent, right? Like in a while, in terms of like ROI for time.
Yeah.
And I think like that's one of the questions that you have to ask. Like if we're in an arms race, like the best way to win is to play a different game,
Yes. Yeah.
basically, because you're probably not gonna outcompete all these other people.
Brilliant. I love that point. The cold calling thing is really interesting. I'd love to go into the cold calling. How did you start learning cold calling? Did you have any really big challenges with cold calling at the beginning, or did it come naturally to you?
No, I hated it. I would not say I'm particularly talented at it. I can do it. I would say like the calling I was doing on Friday as that example was like semi-warm. I'm a lot more comfortable doing that sort of thing now. I think part of it is age. I'm 30 now. So when I was 23, 24, I was a lot more in my head about this. One thing that's kind of just an interesting note, I don't do a lot of cold calling for my business. Candidates don't like being called in the US. They prefer to be emailed, they prefer to be emailed. So that's the general way that we do a lot of recruiting, and it has been my entire career. But that said, like, as soon as I start having a conversation with someone, I want to do everything via the phone. Phone or via Zoom, because that's how you get anything done, right? If you can do things in person, that's how things get done. I do think it's going to be, and I think we're all kind of trying to work this piece out, but I do think the future is going to be, there is going to be a return to in person. There is going to be a return to, kind of this more almost old school approach to doing business, because it just can't be faked. It can't be gamed in the way that, that modern technology allows you to.
Okay. So there's a lot we can go into. I kind of want to let you get your opinion on this new thing I've been working on, which is so the way I've been doing this podcast for the last 5 or 6 years is, and you went through this, it's basically I find somebody interesting to talk to. I ask them on the show, and then I fill out my calendar very far in advance. I do one podcast or like 3 podcasts a week, basically. And so my calendar books out months in advance, and I put them on the calendar for months in advance from now. I actually started this show because I was listening to a podcast with Naval and Tim Ferriss when I was in Mexico City. I think it was Christmas Eve or something like that. And I listened to this podcast, and then I was like, oh, I want to start this podcast and I want to get Naval on the show. And so started the podcast. Naval randomly started following me on Twitter. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to get him on the show. And we email back and forth, we just DM on Twitter back and forth. And then one of the issues with people like Naval, particularly the introverted people like Naval is, and actually myself too, is that basically they don't want to put anything on their calendar. They want to keep it all flowing and free and nothing on the calendar. And so I tried developing a system where I could just essentially email everybody who had said, yes, I want to do a last minute podcast. So I'm going to just email like 25 people. And then people got upset because it was sort of spammy. It was like, it didn't come in, and like, it wasn't a great way to do it. And then I started to book people really far in advance. So now I'm booking people really far in advance. And now I have the opposite problem, which is that most people can't plan 4 months in advance. And so they're just like doing no shows basically. And so now I've given them another option, which is, if you don't like to plan that far in advance, let me just save your number. You save my number and say like, this is Stuart calling as a podcast. And then I just go through the list, like a cold calling list, and then I just do the podcast there. What do you think about that idea?
I mean, it's interesting, right? It's interesting thinking about that. Something I'm experimenting with, running my own business is, can I have a day a week where I don't do any meetings?
Yes. Yeah.
Just because like that makers managers schedule, that Paul Graham talks about is so interesting. This is not related, but I just want to build on my what I said earlier. You brought up Tim Ferriss. I think one of the more interesting things about Tim Ferriss is, I think he went to Princeton, right? But the way he went to Princeton is he studied like Japanese, or it was he studied something that was fairly uncompetitive to get him into like the best university possible, which again, like, I think that was kind of the point that I was trying to make, is where can we be creative and like creatively solve problems as opposed to solving problems through brute force. But that's very difficult to do. It's very frustrating as well. You're like, why have I come up with 0 good ideas? I've been thinking about this for a while. It is, I think, very difficult to make the move and do things that, that frankly, are a little bit creative, are a little bit out of the box.
Yeah, don't want to go too far out of the box too. I was just kidding. So you're in NYC. I imagine there's a reason why you're in NYC, and if it's personal, you don't have to answer it. But if it's professional, like why there instead of San Francisco? Because you're so involved with venture-backed fund. What's going on right now? That is New York like is New York now basically equal in terms of career or not?
Yeah, so I moved to San Francisco in 2016. I actually wanted to originally work in marketing at a tech startup, but fell into sales recruiting. I think most people who are in recruiting, frankly, most people who are in sales, they didn't initially think about it as a career. It was just never really apparent. So I lived in San Francisco until April 2021, and then I moved to New York. So moved about 3 years ago. Frankly, it was just a quality of life thing. I find I'm a pretty extroverted guy. I like going out. I like meeting people. I think New York is the greatest city in the world, at least that I've been to, in terms of you can work extremely hard here and still have a great social life. You know, right now, I've been very just business focused. I've been really boring. All I've been doing is working basically. And I'm still able to do 3 or 4 social events per week, which to me, because I'm quite extroverted, is not a huge amount. You know, that's just like, yes, of course I'll go out Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And this is not saying I'm out till 3 a.m. or
Going
anything. It's
partying,
just
yeah.
I'm seeing people, right?
Yeah.
And I can do that in New York with like zero, like honestly zero effort. Whereas in San Francisco, like that is being a very social person, that is getting out and doing a lot of things. And to answer your question, do I think New York is, you know, up there? Yes, I think it is number 2 when it comes to technology. I do think San Francisco is number 1. I think it would be very difficult, you know, I think anyone who says that it's not is coping. You know, obviously like there's kind of like this, the Gundo, you know, in Los Angeles with regard to hard tech. I think if you're running a D2C, like, you know, direct to consumer brand, you might actually find that you're better off positioned in New York or LA or Austin. You know, if you're selling into finance, you might be better off in New York just because where the buyers are, where the talent is. But for most B2B, like IT software, San Francisco is where it's at. You know, I think anyone saying anything otherwise is selling you a bag of goods. But at the same time, like New York's not that far behind.
Yeah. It's so interesting analyzing New York because I've wanted to live in New York for so long, and then the COVID stuff totally made it harder to do that. And then now inflation went crazy, and with this previous job, a huge amount of the people who worked at the company all lived in New York, and so there's this like, oh, should I move to New York or should I go down south to Brazil and then eventually to Argentina where I found myself, and I've made my way to Buenos Aires, and Buenos Aires is like the only city in the Western Hemisphere that is, besides San Francisco, that is both walkable and has good weather all year round. And so it's the only other city like that. But in comparison to San Francisco, as you mentioned, like San Francisco's full of, I mean this in the kindest way possible, full of internet trolls, basically, autistic trolls, basically, who don't go out a lot. And I love meeting them. I love talking to geeks. But like, and so I have fun in San Francisco going to those meetups, and I love it because it's 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. But here in Buenos Aires, it's this strange mixture of New York, San Francisco, LA, and Washington, D.C. all in one city. And so I'm doing all the meetups and such. But the only problem with that going out at night thing, which you mentioned in New York, doesn't go out until 3 a.m., is that everybody in Buenos Aires goes out at like 11 p.m., even on a Wednesday. And it really starts at 3 a.m. in Buenos Aires, like on a Wednesday, and that's every day. So if like back in the day, it would have been great, but unfortunately, I'm a different person now. So yeah, I love that point about social. How to go for it.
One thing I personally enjoy about New York, I think this is probably quite common for people who have moved from San Francisco, is that like in San Francisco, everyone works in technology. It is a very singular town, right? I think that like the US is kind of like this in a few different ways. Like everyone in Seattle works for Amazon or Microsoft or Boeing. Everyone in DC works for the government in some form or works in politics. You know, and I am stereotyping a little bit, but only a little bit. You know, everyone in Houston's in oil and gas. One of the things I I loved, but I also dislike about San Francisco, it's a double-edged sword, is that everyone is in technology.
Yep.
Oh yeah, that person, they're a lawyer or they're an investment banker.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
but they're working on tech deals. They're working on, like, if Google ends up buying HubSpot or whatever, like they're the ones working on that deal going through. One thing I like about New York is, there are multiple other, like, I would say, like, there are multiple other industries here. So there are a whole lot of people in finance. There are a whole lot of people in law. There are a whole lot of people in publishing and fashion and all of these other, like, and entertainment, all of these other, like, status hierarchies. And it's really nice to hang out with people and, like, they don't know who Sam Altman is. They don't care that Sequoia did X, Y, Z. Like, they just don't think about it. A really good friend of mine is, a guy from New Zealand, and he's in his early 60s. He's a cardiologist. He's now the chief medical officer of a publicly traded biotech, right? Like small cap biotech. And so we'll hang out, and he's like walking me through. They're doing like all of these clinical trials, and I'm like, I have no like, there's no crossover here. It's like, it's very interesting learning about this world, but like, his world and my world, like, they're very different. We're saying CMO, I'm thinking chief marketing officer, he's thinking chief medical officer, like, just worlds apart. And that's really nice, I think, when you're able to connect with people and not kind of even just be cognizant of the, like, what is the industry environment that we're in, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. It does make a lot of sense. It's cross-disciplinary. I mean, San Francisco is a cross-disciplinary place, but I think what you're getting at is that essentially, well, first of all, I want to say that as you were talking, it made me think that New York is essentially what Constantinople was to Rome. And then Washington, D.C. is Rome, basically, for our particular empire. And so there's that is interesting, but the cross-disciplinary thing is really interesting. And I think what you're getting about San Francisco is particularly related to the sort of world-changing ambition that somehow became really important for the rise of technology. And I've done a lot of investigation about this. But there's like it's as you said, singular, maniacal. It's like, it's totally focused. And there's one great tweet, I'm going to butcher it, I think it was from Tiago Forte many years ago. It was just like, if you're talking about your ARR, no, it's more like if you're talking about like contribution margins or some random stuff to investors in San Francisco, they're not gonna be that interested. You have to say that you're going to change the world. You have to say that you're going to take over the world, basically. And New York, like, is the world. It is the world. That's like the capital. It's like that's where everybody goes to do this. Any thoughts on that? Anything you would add?
Yeah, I think one thing I observed, and like one of my theories on, kind of responses to COVID, and I'm talking specifically like the first month or so, right? San Francisco, we don't need to get into 2020, 2021, whatever. But if you think about like the first 6 weeks, 8 weeks of COVID, right? I like February and March of 2020. I remember I flew back to New Zealand for my grandmother's 80th, and then like flew back, and we were talking about it through that time. Right. This was like in early February 2020. But San Francisco closed like down about 3 or 4 full weeks before New York. Right. And I think one of the big differences is people in San Francisco, they're thinking in kind of like exponentials, and they're thinking in 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. Like, my math is not amazing. I'm not a programmer, but like at the 256, 512. Whereas people in New York, they're thinking 7% growth. They're thinking maybe 11% growth. Right. Like in a year. And it's just a reflection of, one is like that's the entire premise of venture, right? We'll give you 4 million, bring us back 400 million. You can scale that up or down as you'd like, but you kind of like, that's the whole game. Whereas no one at Pfizer is thinking, oh, we can 10x our revenue, right? No one at BlackRock is thinking, oh yeah, we can 10x our assets under management in the next 2 years. Like, that's just not happening.
The big numbers are so interesting, and then the big organizations too. We could have a conversation about how AI will change the structure of companies and whether the companies will continue to be massive giants or whether it'll be smaller and leaner. But I want to find out more about your business because it's very interesting. It's like you've got as you mentioned, like sales is very niche. So if I wanted to be a ship captain, then I'll go find that ship captain. And if you know that person, I want to go become a ship captain. So intro me. But just kidding, I don't want to be a ship captain. But so if so you've got basically, and you've got this one specific niche, which is venture-backed startups. What type of customers do you look for, as in your clients, and what type of people do you look for who are looking for jobs in order to find them?
Yeah, so the way I think about it is the kind of companies that I want to work with, they generally have three requirements, right? Or they fit three criteria. The first one is they're selling into the US, that's because that's where I'm based. The second one is they're selling a product of $10,000 per year or more, because with the way that current like sales compensation works, it doesn't really make sense to bring in salespeople on deals of less than $10,000. And then the third thing, and I think worth going into a bit more detail on, is the company needs to be at about $500,000 in revenue. So the founders need to do the first $500,000 in revenue or thereabouts. Like, look, if you're at 450, give me a call, that's fine. But if you're at 50 grand, you really have no business in hiring a salesperson, because you're hiring someone because you want to avoid doing the hard work of speaking to your customers.
Yeah, founder-driven sales, and that's like, there's no way to start a B2B company without doing the sales yourself as somebody on the team.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, that founders don't recognize, if they're trying to escape this, is that being the founder actually, it kind of gives you, I call it like the mandate of heaven, because people don't necessarily want to listen to a salesperson, but they will talk to a founder, right? And there's just an authority that you have. Like, you can do this, right? You're the founder. You're allowed to reach out. You're allowed to, do all of these things. And so, I mean, the other aspect of this is, like, frankly, as a founder, and it's very interesting, like, you can compare and contrast first-time founders and second-time founders. Sometimes the most difficult founders to work with are these 23-year-old wonder kids from Stanford, right? And they've grokked that there's a problem, and they think that there's a technical solution, but they think that sales is easy, right? And often, frankly speaking, a lot of you guys are horrible to work with because you don't value salespeople. But the funny thing is, that same founder 10 years later, after they've had a big exit or whatever, they're starting their second second company, they're the best founders in the world to work with, because they know that hiring salespeople is tricky. They realize that salespeople do a lot of stuff, and actually can bridge gaps. One thing, and kind of to our broader conversation around AI, one thing that AI can't do, and one thing that technology can't do, is it can't bring back a lost deal. It can't push, it can't push when, that deal actually should go through, right? Like, I think, to talk about AI and recruiting, I'm not worried about AI at all. I'm looking forward to using it as much as possible, because I don't think my value as a recruiter is in me sourcing candidates, although I'm very good at it. I don't think it's in me sending out messaging, although I've got very good response rates. I don't think, my value is bringing you someone that you can't otherwise find yourself. My value is in having a crucial conversation and pushing back when I think you're disqualifying a good candidate for an arbitrary reason. And my other value is in getting a candidate over the line when they've said, hey, I'm going to bounce out of this process, when I think deep down, this is the best move for them. Now, those aren't tools that you bust out every day, but those aren't tools that AI is going to replace.
I would love to go more into this sort of the being pushy in sales. I'm not sure if you meant it in this way, but the thing that I got was that if a deal goes bad, a human can turn it around, because a human could be like, hey, we didn't look at this thing, let's look at this, and then have a conversation about it. And It's something I learned really well in this last role I had about, and particularly about leaving on good terms, and that like it's still, the relationship is still open in there because we didn't do the thing that would prevent that. And so it's really interesting, this idea of being pushy in sales, because that's something that I definitely think are two things that are tied together, is that people who are good at sales are good at being pushy. And I mean that with quote marks, because it's like sometimes it's just being assertive or stubborn kind of, but there's a line that can be crossed, which is not fun. But yeah, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I think look, salespeople, I think, have a bad reputation. One of the reasons for that is often the salespeople that you deal with as an everyday person, you know, they're not usually very good. Like your car salesperson, your Verizon salesperson, like they are pushy. And I think the key thing there is they're never going to see you again. Right. So they don't actually really care about whether or not you have a good experience. And I think that's very different. Right. My approach is, I believe a few things. I believe that I don't, yeah, I believe that you can't sell someone something that they don't want. Right. And like the asterisk is, yes, you can sell someone something that they don't want, but you are going to get hit with a refund, right? You are going to have an unhappy customer.
Yeah.
But when I say like, but I don't think you can sell someone and have a happy customer something that they don't want. But sometimes like their objections might be just like frankly wrong. You know, we get these ideas about all sorts of things and they're not necessarily accurate. So I want to be careful with my language here because I don't want to imply that I think being pushy is good, but I also think often we let the conversations that we have in our heads dictate a lot of frankly like coward-like behavior, or like they stop us from taking chances, they stop us from shooting our shot, and they ultimately like deprive us of having a better life. You know, I think one of the ones that I see all the time in my head is if I don't talk to clients for a while. I used to deal with this when I was a bit earlier in my career. If I felt like I hadn't talked to a client for a while, then I would get into a doom loop of, oh, the client doesn't like me. Oh, like, and you just start to spiral. And it's like, no. Like, just call them up. They're usually pretty happy to hear from you.
Yeah.
If they're unhappy, they will tell you, right? And actually, you ghosting them is what will get them to dislike you, right? Like you're doing the very behavior that is going to create the outcome that you don't want, that you're trying to avoid. So that's where I think, like, honestly, a lot of the being pushy, it's actually your own self-talk and pushing yourself. Now, some people are too pushy, right? I think that is, frankly, like it's a very rare case. And like most things in sales, if you've got a good pipeline, you don't need to be too pushy. One thing I'll
go for it.
One thing I'll often say to clients is like, look, if I really believe in a candidate, I will push. Like I will say, I think you should have another interview. But if they bomb that next interview, like, okay, like we'll move on. That's fine. I'm not here to like keep pushing, right? But sometimes people need to be told, like, no, you need to give this thing another go. No, we need to actually do this like one more time.
This is great stuff.
So I think maybe
go for it.
Maybe it's more being stubborn. Like sometimes we just need to be a little bit more stubborn.
So how do you manage, or what are your kind of like your own internal guidelines on how to manage relationships with people that you're doing business with in a vendor capacity? Like how do you think about, how do you act, how do you like what are some of the gotchas involved with selling something to somebody and then signing the contract?
Sorry, what was the capacity? Did you say offender capacity?
Oh, vendor capacity.
Vendor. Okay. I think the key thing is like you just need to have a relationship where it's very clear that you both win. Right? One of my best clients, or my biggest client at my previous agency, I made 48 hires there over 5 years. And yeah, we did bill them quite a lot of money. But I know in terms of the ARR, like they've done really well. You know, I was talking to one of the candidates I placed there. She's coming up 3 years at this company. I think we charged that company $15,000 to make, you know, this specific placement. Well, this woman, she did something like $1.2 million last year. So you tell me who got the better deal out of that one, you know? And like for the candidate, it was a life-changing role as well, which is, you know, also great. But yeah, I think it needs to be win-win, right? You can't always be giving as the vendor, and you know, as like the client, you also can't always be giving, right? Like, frankly, one of the things that happened in recruiting in 2021 and 2022 is a lot of like it was such a candidate-starved market, and a lot of recruiters, like, it was never easier to move up market, and so a lot of people did, and they sold past their ability, and that was, you know, that didn't lead to good outcomes.
Whoa, that's a very interesting externality of having a high velocity of money. I mean, there's a lot of things that happened in 21 and 22, but having a high velocity of money, and that what I mean by that is that for my listeners, it's like once we started to print a large amount of money and then flood that money into the economy, it got overheated, and so people essentially were doing better sales than their ability actually showed, just because of the nature of the strange place that we are. And now it's sort of come back to normal and more towards the opposite now, right? Now it's like the employers have all of the cards in their hand, right?
Yeah, I think that was definitely the case last year. It is coming back a little bit, but it is, yeah, it definitely is still an employer market. The candidates on the market are very good. You know, look, one of the things that's made life really hard in B2B sales, amongst other things, you know, I talked about kind of these channels just being destroyed. There's a lot more competition out than ever before, just the number of B2B SaaS companies. And, you know, we are seeing, like, I think consolidation is a huge problem, right, for the industry. Just in terms of, like, there have been so many new vendors that have sprung up. Finding a place is just harder to do. But one of the things that we've tried, sales is pretty simple compared to, say, product management or marketing or engineering, in that you assign a numerical target to every person that you hire. So you've got a pretty good idea of whether or not you got a good ROI, right? Now, one of the things that we saw from 2017 to like 2022 was the amount of money that we paid salespeople went up a lot, probably by like 50%, maybe even more, right? And performance fell off a cliff. So, like, frankly, like, more money was spent, right? This is like the difficult thing with things like remote and, you know, so on and so forth. Like, we made these changes, and frankly, like, they didn't lead to more performance, right? It's very easy to get on LinkedIn and say, pay people more, you'll get better performance. But do you, right? Like, you've got to go all remote or you're losing out on top performers. That's often said by someone who's had 6 jobs in 4 years. Are they a top performer? Like, not in my view, right? So it's very easy to say these things. If you really want to stir the pot, you know, like a lot of these like DEI things, like DEI makes for like better performing companies. Like, I've heard that spouted 1,000 times. I've never seen a single study back it up. Like, do I think you should hire women onto your sales team? Do I think you should hire, like, you know, people from all sorts of backgrounds? Absolutely. And it's better to do it earlier than later, because it's really hard when you got 20 white dudes on a team to bring in anyone else, right? Like, it's not a fun environment. And that's a really hard search. But we've said all of these things, right? And it's a combination. We've put up pay, we've made like the working environment a lot easier, and performance has fallen. And so you do have to ask. And I actually, if we really want to get ourselves into trouble here, I think that's the whole problem across venture capital. These LPs gave venture capital a huge amount of money. And where are the returns? Right? It's a very unfortunate reality. And it's one that we are.
And it's on a 10-year time horizon too. For my listeners who don't know about venture capital, so an LP is the person who invests inside of the venture fund. The venture fund is run by the VCs, but they get their investment from the LPs, most of which are usually endowments or I'm sorry, well, there's endowments, and then there's the pension funds, and then there's all these other sources. But all that money, they can't invest it themselves in the way that they want, so they give it to the VC, and the VC invests in riskier things. But it all with the intention of getting a 10x or more return somewhere down the line on a 10-year time horizon. And so what I love about what you just said is that so we got the high velocity of money for 2020 and 2021. Now things have kind of changed a bit, but I have some skepticism over how much they've actually changed. So there could be a continue of high velocity money, and all the VCs are being marked by their 10-year time horizon. And so there's that high velocity of money is adding a whole bunch of crazy things to this system that worked pretty well from 1990 to 2010. Although I've heard that I've heard some skepticism that VC has ever worked because it's such a time horizon. Actually, do you know anything about this? Like how to evaluate VC and like some of the things at play?
Well, I think my understanding of this, and this is very much a layman's understanding, is that VC, like as an asset class, is either terrible or amazing, right? You don't get kind of like middling returns, right? It's like it is very much a 10x like multiplier, like, and if we say 1990 to 2010, well, you had the dot-com like crash in the middle of that, right? But you also had a lot of winners, right? Like if you were that Accel fund that was like the first check into Facebook, I'm pretty sure those venture investors are very happy, right? Like everyone who invested in Google back in like the mid 90s made out like bandits. I'm pretty sure everyone who invested in Yahoo made out like bandits, right? So I think the key thing is with like venture capital is it either really works or it really doesn't. Talking a little bit about this velocity of money, one insight that this guy was a VP of sales, he's now a founder, he brought to my attention, this was probably about 5 years ago, and it's so true, is that any company, right? And you can look at this, if you're a salesperson listening to this, any company that raises a very large Series B, and I'm going to benchmark that at $75 million or above, and the funding, like the founding team has not had an exit of at least, call it $500 million, or as a public company, avoid. Because the difference between raising $25 million and $75 million is that all of your numbers are 3x, right? And I think like the key thing is that 10-year time horizon, it's kind of true. A friend of mine who worked in venture capital explained it to me like this. It's not really actually a 10-year time horizon. Like on the one hand it is, but it's also, as a venture fund, every 3 years or so, you raise your next fund.
That's right. Yeah.
So actually you want to show markups in about a 36-month time frame so that you can raise your next fund, right? And the way to think about this, like, as an individual contributor, as someone who's going to go and join one of these VC companies, is that founders will say, hey, we've got 9 years of cash, like in the bank, so we've got like more or less infinite runway. But that's actually not true, because they're going to be pushed, like regardless, like when you get on the venture treadmill, they want you raising in 18 months. They want you raising in 24 months or 36 months. Like, and that's fine, right? Like I don't actually think there's anything wrong with that, but I think you just have to recognize that you don't magically have 5 or 6 years to figure this out. Like you've got 24 months to figure this out, and actually just to double revenue, right? So look, if your company, like an explicit example of this, right? One of the early companies that we did a lot of hiring for at my previous company was Samsara. Now, the founders of Samsara sold Meraki to Cisco. They sold it for like 1.3 billion cash. They built Meraki into like a $500 million a year machine. And then Samsara, like they hit the ground running. I think they raised like 25 million, and Andreessen joined the board at like Series A, and they were just rocking, right? Like, and they were on fire. Like that's your exception to the rule. The founders had done it before. They were just pulling in everyone who they'd worked with before and running the same playbook. Like that's a publicly traded company now. They're at, I think, more than $1 billion in ARR. Like, of course they did great, right? That's very much the exception. If you're a first-time founder, like you're just not moving that fast. And that's fine. Just don't raise money like you're going to move that fast, because all you do is you churn through sales teams. Like you bring in a whole lot of people, you don't give them enough time to succeed, so you fire them and you rip and replace. But I think, like the other aspect of this, right, is like it's all downstream. So you start at the very top, which is like these pension funds have funding gaps, right? Like that's the core problem. And we can't say to pensioners that, hey, you're a teacher, we're actually going to cut your pension. Like the politicians don't want to have that difficult conversation, right? Like that's actually where it all starts.
Yeah.
So okay, the endowment, we need to like invest in what is it, like higher alpha, higher beta, whatever the like financial term is, assets. So we'll put money into private equity, we'll put money into venture capital. So we'll give these VCs more money, right? So they've got more money to spend. So they give founders more money, right? Which means that they need to bring in more revenue. So they bring in salespeople, or they bring in sales leaders, and like everyone's like 60% confident that they can pull off that number. And as the salesperson, like you're just at the very bottom of a very large pyramid, right? But like everyone's trying to like measure up to these gaps. So I think one of the key things, and something I actually look for with companies I work with, is like, have they raised a sensible amount of funding? Because if they've raised too much, if they're too panicked about their hiring, like from a vendor point of view, they're not usually very pleasant to work with. And frankly, like the outcomes they get are usually very poor.
Yeah. It's so interesting. It's just like everything is connected. That comes back to, and that brings to mind what I wanted to say about Samsara. I love that they named it Samsara. For you or maybe some of my listeners who don't know, that Samsara is like a term from Buddhism, or it might even be older than Buddhism, of just like the nature of our reality. That it's sort of like a churning, insane thing that we're in, and we don't know how we got quite here. And so I love that they named it Samsara. Do you know why they named it Samsara? Do you have any insight into how they named it that? No.
I don't know. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm gonna go.
But yeah,
go check
it is.
that.
It's a great name.
Yeah. Okay, so we got a lot of stuff. What time do you have to go? If at any point you have to go.
Got like another 15, 20 minutes.
Cool.
Not in a rush.
So, okay. Talked a lot about things. There's a bunch of questions I have in the back of my head. Oh yeah, so we talked about your customers. What about the people that you help place in jobs? What are you looking for there?
It's actually a pretty easy, I would say, like it's a pretty easy math equation. There are so many people that have worked in technology sales. We can actually be quite specific. And so, for example, like a client of mine, they are selling into, they sell into commercial real estate developers. And there are enough commercial real estate startups out there that we can find great early stage commercial salespeople, right? Another client of mine, they were looking for people who had sold into hedge funds, right? Have you worked at a startup? Usually what I am looking for is it's a combination of things. I want someone who is familiar with the deal size. That's often quite important. So just what size of deal are they selling into? I am often looking for someone who has got a track record of achievement. That's really important. Also just like ability to keep a job. Again, like, opinions that'll get me canceled in 2024. But I also don't think it's hard to keep your employees for a year, right? Like a lot of managers can't manage to do that. The other things that I'm looking for, we've got to make the logistics work. So from like a location point of view, from a comp point of view, those things need to make sense. The other thing is just like interest in company, interest in stage of company is also important. Like, look, if you want to go and work at Bloomberg, go and work at Bloomberg, right? I had a candidate, we actually got them to an offer late last year, and this was at a seed stage company. This would have been like sales account executive number 3. And they had an offer from Salesforce. And I was like, just take the Salesforce offer. Because like, why, like, if you want to go and work at a big company, don't go and be employee 26. Like it's fine. It's perfectly legitimate as a career choice. There's no moral dimension to should you join a startup or not. It's just a preference thing. But frankly, like, I think you want people who don't need to be convinced, right? Like that's a big thing.
Ooh, interesting. Yeah, this is such an interesting thing about the early stage company versus the late stage company. I think it's preference. It's definitely preference, but embedded in that preference, there's also a temperament. Like I know that
Yes.
it can't work at a big company. Like it's just not part of my skill set to manage that complexity of having so many people and having the kind of like the PR legal stuff all the time. In startups, I do great
I
at
like working with
it. Go for it.
founders, you know,
Yeah,
so
interesting.
I don't want to work, I don't want to work with, like, frankly, you know, 3 layers away from the hiring manager, have to go through HR. Like, I don't want to do that, right? I
Yeah.
would much rather work with a founder, an early sales leader. That's far more interesting to me.
Ooh,
I like those people a lot more.
that's a good question. So so we've got the founders, and then we're imagining like a company that's already got their first sales. The founders have been doing a lot of good sales, and then at some point the founder needs to replace themselves with a salesperson. What is the key to the hiring that person?
Yeah, so the best resource for this is SaaStr, SaaStr, and Jason Lemkin. I think, you know, that man deserves a Nobel Peace Prize for everything he's done
Yeah.
for SaaS.
Yeah.
Just truly like an incredible resource. But the general argument is, and I've written a little bit about this on my blog, which is just on my website, is, you know, you want to hire your first two account executives. The reason you want two is then you
Mm.
can A/B test. So you know, if why
Oh,
was one successful,
interesting.
why wasn't one successful. You don't want to hire SDRs as your first people, because they cost, like, in terms of fixed costs, they cost about 70% as much as an account executive, and they're about 20% as useful. They require a lot more management as well.
Mm.
You usually don't want to hire a VP of sales, because if you're hiring a VP of sales, you need to be ready to put $2 million into your sales org. You know, in terms of hiring 4 to 5 account executives and really getting that motion going.
Yeah.
Um, so generally, the way I would think about it is usually you have to hire your first two, you know, account executives. Then possibly it's time to add a BDR or SDR or two. And then I would think about hiring a sales leader. You know, look, if you get to 2 account executives and you decide it's time for a head of sales, like, whatever. But I think you want to start with those individual contributors first. And then if you need help on the lead generation side, you hire SDRs, BDRs. And the way to think about SDRs and BDRs, because, you know, a lot of ink is spilled on this one.
Yep.
Again, like, I've written a post on this. The way to think about an SDR, is that in their first year, you know, if you do some very basic math, an SDR in the United States, they cost about $120,000,
Mm.
right? Fully
Mm.
loaded,
Mhm.
before you add in any management costs. But by the time you recruit them, you know, internal recruiters have a cost too. By the time you pay them, because the difference between an SDR and an account executive is that you pay them, you know, regardless of if deals close, you pay them on, like, meetings booked. By the time you pay for their health insurance, their employer taxes, you know, buy them a laptop, the various softwares that they need, you're at 120K.
Yep.
Now, if you assume that they take 2 months to ramp up, and I'm just doing this for simplicity of math, but 2 months to ramp up, and that, you know, you promote them after a year, and that they book 12 meetings a month, you're at 120 meetings. That's $1,000 per meeting booked. It's not a very good ROI,
Oh,
right? But the way to think about SDRs and where you make all your money on them is when you promote them to account executives, because their tenure and the length of time that they stay at companies is so much longer than any externally. Like,
oh,
again, I ran all of the numbers on every hire I've made. So the way to think about them is, like, they're not there, like, they break even basically in the first year, but you are building out like a future talent bench for your company. In the same way, you know, and I am speaking not from experience here, but I think hiring junior software engineers, I think makes the same argument. And I know, look, you don't keep everyone,
mm,
but the
mm.
ROI, I was talking to the VP of sales at, you know, the client who I'd done 48 searches with. And we talked about this, and I ran him through just some of the numbers, because frankly, a lot of the people that I'd placed were at his organization. And he's like, yep, everything you're saying is, like, lines up with what I'm seeing. It can just be hard to push that, like, argument to the CFO. The other
Mm.
way to think about this, right, is that tech sales doesn't really scale. Like they like your top reps don't really bring, like they might bring in 1.5x or 1.3x, you know, maybe even 2x, like an average rep, but they don't bring in 50x, right? Like that just doesn't really happen. And like, you know, you can point to me, oh, well, this guy at Salesforce did $100 million deal. Yep. Your startup is not doing $100 million deals, right? Like a big deal for you guys might be 80 grand, right? Like let's just pack it in for a minute, right? Like you don't have the infrastructure to do those kind of deals. So start like, and again, Jason Lemkin talks a lot about this, but like sales doesn't really scale. It's a pretty like linear kind of scaling as opposed to like an exponential kind of scaling. And so again, like, you know, if you're trying to double your org in terms of like, hey, we need to double our revenue, well then assuming you've got a good sales motion, you need to double your headcount every year. And like this, the hiring math, it gets terrifying when you consider that you've probably got 30% churn year over year because you're firing some people for not performing and some people are leaving. And you know, like one of the downsides of the 4-year cliff is that, you know, like that is usually about as long as people stay.
Interesting. Is that's not because of
Yeah.
the
So
cliff,
like,
but that's not because of the cliff. That's just because of the nature of people moving on, or is it?
yeah, but I think like because, you know, often like because you end like your 4-year vesting schedule,
Yeah.
usually like people, I would say like use that as a trigger to leave.
Yeah. I got it. Yep. Interesting.
But yeah, I think like so the way to think about like keeping an SDR organization is frankly like it can solve 50% of your recruiting burden, right? Like year over year. Now the difficulty with an
Oh,
SDR
got it.
organization
Yeah.
is
Of
there
young.
is probably like 100, there's like 120% churn in that org, but that's feeding your account executive organization in a year, right? With all the best, right? Who are going to stay there for 4 or 5 years. So that would be how I would think about like those more junior salespeople.
Okay, that's really interesting. One more question, and then we'll wrap it up. What is business development and what is good business development?
Pretty interchangeable. Like sales and business development, like more or less mean the same thing. Sales development rep, business development rep, you can't convince me that, you know, that they're anything else. Occasionally you'll see like partnerships, you know, like mixed in there. Partnerships is a very muddy term.
Yeah.
It's very, very hard to define. I think it's very, very hard to say what's good in partnerships. I remember like one of the best VPs of sales I've ever worked with. He took an org from 0 to 25 mil. Very like scrappy bootstrapped org as well. They sold that company for more than $100 million. Yeah, I would say like one of the very best. And I remember talking to him about it, and he's just like, the difficult thing is it's so hard to define what success is like in a partnership, you know, in a partnership sense.
Interesting. So this gets to the whole thing. Well, this last thing is that there's it's like sales, although it is very easy to see that the ROI has been achieved because of all the numbers and such, and because because of that, it's easy to see, which is like almost like the opposite problem of technology and being a technologist and programming, is that at the lowest level of a programming, you know whether something has failed or not. And so a lot of people go there because there's the certainty of that. And the social relationships are so tricky. And then on the other end, it's like, but without that company, without the commercialization of it, it's not, the whole thing is going to fall apart. So there's this strange like thing that switches all of a sudden to sales. And I think you're right about the AI thing, that sales and all of the stuff involved with sales is never going away because that is just so fundamental. Whereas the technology thing there's now in question. Like at least in software, the building of technology may not be as lucrative as it has been over the past few years. If you want to respond to that, feel free to respond to it. Otherwise, we can wrap up.
Yeah, I think, look, this is kind of my general theory on things, and this is possibly a little bit of a ramble. So, the way I would think about this, right, is like salespeople are constantly fighting every single day the buy button, right? That buy button on Amazon. Frankly, now when you buy a new iPhone, you're just buying that online. You're buying a new MacBook online, right? Like that buy button, the value of a buy button, it goes up every single day, right? Like if you want a good salesperson in a retail environment in the United States and you're buying shoes, you're either buying athletic shoes for a couple $100 or you're spending at least $500. Like you are not getting a good sales experience.
Got it.
Like it's not likely you're getting a good sales experience buying like an $80 pair of Nikes. It's just unlikely, right?
Yeah.
100 years ago, guys were
Got it.
door to door selling magazine subscriptions. They were selling life insurance. Now, like, you've got to spend at least $500 on a pair of shoes for that same quality of person. In the B2B sense, like this is what I was saying, you need to really be spending about 10K to get like a real human interaction, like where it's really worth it. Now that number's always going to go up, right? We're always going to be fighting that. That's just reality. That's coming like rain in the winter.
Yeah.
But I also think like you're not going to replace that, because at some point when it comes to like buying something, you want to speak to someone. You have some questions. And also I think there's something to be said for someone to blame, right? Like you're going to feel like a dumbass.
Yeah.
If you buy a solution, it's unproven, you've spent 50 grand on it and you didn't talk to anyone, like what were you thinking?
Yeah.
And so I think there's like, that's the human element. And I think,
Yeah, interesting.
one of the things that like, I've seen a few people talk about the $1 billion, like 10-person company, right? And it's an interesting concept.
Yeah.
Where I think that like falls down is, there's this guy, Dan Fazio. He's like an internet marketer, really like interesting follow, but he's got this great concept, right? And it's all about logistical intensity. So how difficult is the thing that you're doing, right, to pull off, right? Now, if you think like, if we take like a very logistically intense business, General Motors, extremely logistically intense, right? They take a whole lot of raw materials and they turn it into cars. That's really difficult to do, right? I think if you look at like a lot of the technology companies that people like point to, often they are actually very difficult in terms of like the technical breakthrough that they have achieved. I'll give you like an example. I've got some friends who work in an adjacent space to Figma, and they were talking about look, I'm not a tech guy. Like I work in tech, but I'm not I know what an API is. That's about where it gets. That's where I start to lose, but they were talking about like the technical infrastructure of Figma, right? And just how advanced it was relative to Adobe. And apparently Adobe like put thousands of engineers on like a Figma copycat and they weren't able to do it, right? And part of that is like, part of that is going to be like technical innovation. And part of that is you are just chasing like the go-to-market. You're now chasing revenue as well. But I think if you look at like every genuinely impressive technology startup, and now technology company, they are doing something that's very difficult. Like I think Cloudflare would be really difficult to replicate with 10 people. I just don't think you can do it.
Okay, that comes back to yeah, exactly. Okay, go on.
I think like the final thing that I would say there is like will companies be smaller in the future? Probably, but people also like to manage other people. Like there is an aspect to that. And I think again, like it's very easy to look at this logically and like remove the human element, but you just have to think like if you had, whatever your number is, $10 million, $100 million or whatever, do you want staff? Like, and let me give you the out. You don't have to manage them, right? But there is something I think a little bit more prestigious about, hey, I've got 500 employees as opposed to I've got 5. Especially if you don't have to manage the 500 employees.
Yeah, because there are a lot of founders out there who are interested in legacy. And what gets you legacy? Like 15 people valued at 10 billion, or like 10,000 people, and a lot of them will choose 10,000 people.
It's one thing I think about, right, with like venture capital, and the argument for venture capital in my mind is it's not actually a financial argument. It is an interesting thing to talk about at cocktail parties.
Yes,
Like,
exactly. Yeah,
okay,
yeah,
yes, I've dollar cost averaged my $1 billion fortune into like the S&P 500. No one cares. Oh no, I was a lead investor in like OpenAI.
yeah,
Oh, now you're like,
yeah,
now
yeah,
you're the cool guy, right? At
yeah,
the party.
yeah,
It's the same
yeah,
reason you'd
yeah,
finance movies. It's the
yeah,
same reason you invest in a restaurant.
yeah.
It's not entirely logical. And I think,
Yes.
it's easy to be
Social
overly
proof is not
logical.
logical. Social proof is not logical. Yeah.
My final thought here, because I saw this a little while ago, and I think it's like it kind of hits on the same vein. I was talking to my dad. So my parents have a small business in New Zealand, right? And my dad doesn't spend a huge amount of money, on himself. I would say he had 5 kids, so he was always spending, but I wouldn't say a lot of it was on himself, right?
Mm.
But we were talking, and he was talking about the car park at the front of the building. They reconcreted all of the car park, and that was really expensive. It was like 60 grand. This is not a huge area, right? And he was doing like a big order. My parents sell mobility scooters, so he was like buying a whole lot of mobility scooters. And one of his employees had crashed a van. Thankfully, everyone was all right, but like had to get a new van. And like I was talking to him, and I was like, my dad probably just rattled off like $200,000 worth of expenses, maybe more,
Wow.
right? Probably. And the core thing there is I saw this LinkedIn post, and it was talking about how the CFO is in more deals than ever and how it's bad for the salesperson.
Huh.
And I think like that, just looking at it all wrong. The person who suffers the most when the CFO is in the deal is actually the CEO. Because the whole, like one of the core benefits, I don't think it's the primary benefit, but
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
it's
I
a
got it.
tertiary
Yeah,
benefit
yeah,
of being a CEO is you get to spend money. And spending money is fun,
yeah,
right? Like everyone loves to spend money. Even if people are frugal in their personal lives,
yeah.
you give those people a work budget, they are
Yeah.
ready to spend, And I think like one of the reasons, you get all of these bootstrap founders and they're really salty towards venture capital,
Yeah.
like VC-backed founders,
Yeah.
is my theory on this is like raising venture capital is 70% as good as winning the lottery. It's more socially acceptable, and then B, you get almost the same benefits, right? So like you don't get to like buy a Ferrari, but I can take all my clients to a Ferrari track day, right? Like I don't get to buy a big house, but I can like get an office in a really nice part of town. I can't travel wherever I want, but there's a conference in Argentina that I want to go to, right? So like I feel like and you get like the social benefit, and so I think like when you think about these things, it's important to think about the technological argument for it, right? But kind of getting back to like that ones and zeros piece, it you can't quantify this, but like how much value did Johnny Ive bring to Apple through his design skills, right? Like possibly 80% of the market cap is through his design.
Yeah.
But like, but there's no way of really thinking about that because you like the skill on itself without the infrastructure is worth zero.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Without the
Like
infrastructure.
without like Taylor Swift's infrastructure, she's just another woman singing outside like the strip mall, right? But like it's not the talent alone. It's this confluence of things. But thank you for letting me ramble on that one.
No, that's great. I love it. The skill itself without the infrastructure is brilliant. Thank you so much for coming on the show. How can people find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, sure. So I'm the only Sam Marelich, Marelich, around. So I'm on most of the social platforms. Twitter is probably the best place to find me, or my website is yournextventure.co. And if you are a venture-backed startup and you want help hiring, would love to talk to you.
Cool. Thank you.